The cold wind bit at Winterfell as Ned Stark walked through the courtyard, his mind heavier than his armor. The banners flapped in the grey sky, and the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. But this time, Ned didn't feel the usual weight of honor pressing on his shoulders. Something had changed in him, a spark that had been buried under duty, loyalty, and too many betrayals. He looked at the snow, thinking not of justice, but of power. For too long, honor had made him weak in a world built on lies and blood. When King Robert arrived, Ned played the role of the loyal friend and hand, nodding at every word, yet his mind worked like a blade sharpening itself. Jon Arryn's death had been too convenient, the Lannisters too bold, and the king too blind. He had seen it coming, the corruption, the scheming, the endless plots, but unlike before, he no longer intended to wait for fate to decide his hand. Ned Stark would act first. In the first council meeting, where courtiers whispered and swords of other lords shimmered behind their backs, Ned's presence was different. His voice was calm, but there was an edge that hadn't existed before. He asked questions, yes, but not like the naive man who wanted truth. This time he asked questions that could trap men, that could strip their masks off and leave them exposed. Every answer became a weapon, every hesitation a reason to fall. Lords who had laughed at his honor before now felt a subtle chill when he looked at them. The first test came sooner than he expected. A small rebellion in the Riverlands had grown bolder, thinking the North would never act. But Ned's new self would not wait for mercy to fail. He moved with precision, sending troops not just to quell the rebellion, but to crush it entirely. He spared no one who stood in his way. Peasants who resisted were shown the strength of a lord who no longer waited for justice. He delivered inevitability. Word spread quickly. The Stark who once could be trusted to judge fairly now judged like winter itself, unforgiving, absolute, final. Even Robb noticed it, though he said nothing. The boy saw his father's eyes, sharper, colder, calculating in a way that scared even the bravest of bannermen. Sansa and Arya felt it in subtle ways, the way the servants trembled when he passed, the hush in the halls of Winterfell. Ned Stark was still Ned Stark, but he was also something else now, a force of reckoning in a kingdom built on fear and manipulation. Then came the letters from King Robert, summoning Ned to King's Landing. Normally, he would have felt dread. Now he only felt opportunity to take control, to remove the snakes in the crown, and to carve a place for his family that no Lannister or schemer could undo. He knew the road would be dark, but the darkness no longer scared him. It was his ally. As the snow fell that night, Ned stood alone on the battlements, staring at the horizon. The wind whipped his cloak, and he thought about the choices he had never dared to make, the vengeance he had restrained, the strategies he had rejected, the fear he had swallowed. Now he would wield them all. Westeros would remember Ned Stark, not as a man of honor, but as a storm that no blade could calm, a wolf that would hunt all who dared to challenge him. The North had always been fierce, but soon all of Westeros would feel the bite of the Stark who had chosen power over mercy. And in that cold night, with the stars hidden behind the clouds, Ned Stark smiled, not with warmth, but with a certainty that would terrify every lord, king, and knight he would meet. Ned Stark rode south with a cold purpose, the familiar pine-scented air of the north replaced by the damp, salty smell of the narrow sea. Every mile toward King's Landing brought him closer to the heart of treachery, but instead of dread, Ned felt anticipation. The city had long been a nest of vipers, each plotting against the other, and he knew that if he approached it as the man he had once been, honorable, predictable, he would be devoured. No, he had shed that skin. Now he would enter as a predator cloaked in the guise of loyalty, a wolf among foxes, waiting for the first sign of weakness. His entourage, composed of loyal northern soldiers and wary bannermen, rode in silence, sensing the difference in their lord. Whispers of a change in him had already begun to reach even the distant corners of the north, but no one yet fully understood its depth. The gates of King's Landing rose before him like walls of shadow, tall and imposing. Ned dismounted with a grace that belied the storm in his mind. The city itself seemed alive with whispers, rumors curling through the streets like smoke from braziers. Lannister banners hung over the Red Keep, golden lions gleaming arrogantly as though mocking him. He ignored the insult. The time for courtesy had passed. In his mind, he was already 2 moves ahead of every noble, every soldier, every spy in the city. Where once he had sought justice, he now sought dominance, and dominance required subtlety, precision, and unflinching resolve. When he entered the council chambers, King Robert greeted him with his usual boisterous laughter, slapping Ned on the shoulder. "Eddard, my friend, it's been too long. The north must be colder than ever." The king's eyes, warm and blind to the undercurrents of danger, met Ned's, and Ned smiled, a calm, polite mask that hid the storm beneath. "It is cold, your grace," he replied, his voice steady, measured, but carrying a weight that made Robert pause for a fraction of a second. It was a pause no one else had ever noticed, but Ned had learned to see the cracks in even the strongest masks, and perhaps it should be for those who underestimate their enemies. Court murmured, sensing a subtle shift in the air. Ned's presence carried something different now, the quiet command of a man who had tasted power and chosen it over sentiment. He listened to the discussions, the reports of unrest, the whispers of rebellion, the petty squabbles among lords. But he did not respond as before with moral appeals or cautious diplomacy. Instead, he asked questions that exposed lies, that cornered liars, that hinted at consequences far beyond what anyone could imagine. Every word was a blade, every look a warning. By the end of the meeting, the courtiers left with a mixture of awe and fear. Ned Stark had arrived in King's Landing, but not the Ned Stark they had expected. As days passed, Ned began quietly assembling his network, identifying those loyal only to themselves, those who might betray him, and those who could become allies under the right pressure. He used his reputation as a man of honor to disarm suspicion, while planting seeds of uncertainty in the minds of his enemies. Petter Baelish, ever ambitious, tried to read Ned's intentions, but the Stark now moved like a shadow, unpredictable, patient, and dangerous. Even the small folk sensed the difference. Rumors of a wolf in the city began to spread, not the noble Stark they had heard about, but a wolf who hunted not for pride, but for survival and supremacy. The first real test came sooner than expected. A small faction of Lannister loyalists, believing Ned would be an easy target, attempted to undermine him by spreading false accusations about his northern methods. Normally, Ned would have sought counsel, perhaps a quiet reprimand. Now he acted decisively. In a single night, he traced the network of informers, identified their leaders, and neutralized the threat with precision. Some were imprisoned, some disappeared under circumstances that left whispers but no proof. By morning, the message had spread through the city. Ned Stark was no longer merely honorable. He was ruthless, deliberate, and untouchable to those who thought to deceive him. Even the king began to notice. Robert laughed at first, assuming it a performance for effect. But as Ned began to manipulate the council subtly, directing resources, controlling information, and quietly punishing those who failed or betrayed him, Robert began to grow uneasy. He did not yet fear Ned, but he sensed the tides were shifting, and Ned did not fear Robert either. The king had been a friend, a fool, a pawn in the games of others, and now a man whose loyalty could be commanded or discarded depending on the hour. Ned's mind considered possibilities most would not dare imagine, alliances with the Tyrells to counterbalance Lannister power, subtle provocations to divide the Baratheon family, whispers of rebellion that could be stoked or snuffed at his discretion. Every action he took was a calculated risk, designed not merely to survive, but to dominate. Ned's children arrived shortly after him, and he observed them carefully. Sansa still carried the naive hope of a world ruled by honor. Arya, sharper, already sensed the change in her father. Jon Snow, loyal and brave, remained her father's shadow. Unaware yet of the depths Ned was willing to explore, Ned began to instruct them in the ways of true power, teaching them not just swordsmanship, but perception, patience, and manipulation. The lessons were subtle at first, framed as prudence and wisdom, but they carried an edge that would mark the next generation of Starks as more than just honorable. They would be feared. By the time the first snow of winter fell in King's Landing, Ned Stark had transformed the Red Keep without overt displays of force. He had made allies, neutralized enemies, and planted seeds of fear that spread faster than any army could march. The whispers of dangerous clung to him like a shadow, a warning to every noble who thought to oppose him. No one could quite put a finger on what he would do next, and that uncertainty was his greatest weapon. In the quiet of the night, Ned stood on the battlements of the Red Keep, staring down the glowing city below. The lanterns flickered like distant stars, and he imagined the lives he would bend, the houses he would control, the games he would win. The Ned Stark who had once died for honor had ceased to exist the moment he embraced a darker truth. In a world where deceit, ambition, and cruelty ruled, only those willing to wield their own shadow could survive. And so, the wolf in the north had become a storm in King's Landing. A storm no one had seen coming, and soon none would forget. The tension in King's Landing grew thick like smoke over the city. Every street whispered of rumors, of a Stark who no longer bowed to tradition, who no longer moved as the naive Lord of the North. Ned Stark had become more than a hand. He had become a force that could not be ignored. The Lannisters, confident in their power and wealth, assumed the usual leverage would sway him. They underestimated the wolf they had thought was just a loyal friend. Each word, each gesture from Ned now carried a calculated weight, designed to unsettle and expose. In private meetings, he asked questions that seemed casual, almost naive, but they revealed more than the Lannisters knew they were sharing. A glance, a pause, the slightest hesitation, Ned noted it all, storing information like a predator, mapping the movements of prey. Cersei Lannister was the first to sense the danger. She had spent her life manipulating men, but Ned was unlike any man she had encountered. He did not bribe or flatter. He observed, anticipated, and struck without warning. She tried to draw him into court intrigues, whispering rumors about Robert, about his allies, and even about his own family, hoping to provoke missteps. Ned's response was chilling in its restraint. He listened, he nodded, he feigned concern, but in the shadows of his mind, he catalogued her every scheme. By the time the Queen realized he had not reacted as expected, he had already ensured that the rumors would backfire, quietly sowing doubt among her supporters. Tywin Lannister, ever calculating, attempted to measure Ned's strength by subtle tests of loyalty. He sent envoys with empty threats, tried to bribe men in the north, and even questioned the loyalty of the Stark bannermen. But Ned had anticipated such maneuvers. He countered them quietly, using the same channels Tywin relied upon to spread false information. Within days, Tywin's efforts had not only failed, but strengthened Ned's position. Allies who had once served the Lannisters now considered approaching the Stark camp for protection. Fear of the North had transformed into respect, and fear of Ned Stark personally was beginning to eclipse all others. One night, a messenger arrived with news that stirred the city. Jon Arryn's death had not gone unnoticed by other houses in Westeros. Several small lords sought to test Ned, hoping to seize advantage in a kingdom that seemed more unstable than ever. They assumed they could manipulate him with threats or promises. What they did not know was that Ned Stark now thought in layers and shadows, not in simple morality. He invited the representatives to a council in the Red Keep, promising to hear their grievances. When they arrived, they were met not with anger or the hand of the king, but with the icy, deliberate calm of a man who could see every lie before it was spoken. Questions were posed that seemed ordinary at first, but each answer the lords gave ensnared them further. By the end of the council, more than one noble left terrified, understanding for the first time that the North's wolf could strike from any corner at any time. But Ned did not stop with intimidation alone. He began reshaping the city in ways subtle yet unmistakable. Guards loyal to the crown now took orders from him, quietly redirected by his northern allies. Supplies, trade, and even the flow of information was subtly rerouted to favor the Stark influence. By controlling the networks of power, Ned created a city within a city, a silent empire operating under the guise of loyalty to the king. Those who tried to resist found themselves cut off, their schemes unraveling before they could gain traction. He punished betrayal not with spectacle, but with precise, effective actions that left his enemies weakened and isolated, their power stripped without drawing the attention of the masses. Meanwhile, Robert's indulgence in wine and hunting allowed Ned to maneuver without interference. The king still trusted him implicitly, unaware that the hand's loyalty was no longer naive obedience, but strategic calculation. Ned considered Robert's weaknesses not as an insult, but as an opportunity. The king's carelessness could be leveraged to stabilize the realm, or, if necessary, to eliminate threats entirely. Ned Stark had become the kind of ruler no one had expected. Outwardly loyal, inwardly merciless, capable of controlling the lives of thousands with a glance or a well-placed suggestion. The Game of Thrones once a dangerous puzzle he had approached with honor, was now a board where he moved his pieces with deliberate ruthlessness. The Stark children were not left untouched by this transformation. Sansa began to understand the necessity of appearances, Arya the power of patience and observation, and Jon the strength of decisiveness. Ned's lessons extended beyond swords and strategy. They were lessons in survival, manipulation, and fear. He taught them that Westeros did not reward honor but power, and that to wield power effectively, one must be willing to embrace the darkness others denied. Each child learned, in their own way, that the wolf was no longer a symbol of nobility, but a harbinger of inevitability. It was during a feast in the Red Keep that Ned's influence became unmistakable. The Lannisters had invited him under the pretense of camaraderie, seeking to test whether the Northern Lord still clung to honor or had softened under the Southern sun. Ned accepted with grace, masking the storm within. Throughout the night, he listened, smiled, and made small gestures that seemed innocuous, yet by the end, alliances had shifted subtly. A minor lord, swayed by Ned's calm authority, pledged loyalty in a whisper, while another, previously allied with Cersei, quietly reconsidered his position. The feast ended with laughter and clinking goblets, but the true battle had been waged in silence, and the Stark had emerged victorious. Yet not all recognized the change immediately. Tyrion Lannister, sharp and cynical, sensed the shift in Ned, though he could not yet name it. "The wolf has grown teeth sharper than any I've seen," Tyrion whispered to himself, observing from the shadows, "and he knows how to bite without drawing attention." The clever dwarf began to reassess his own moves, realizing that the man once admired for honor now played a game of shadows and knives. Tyrion's subtle plotting became entwined with Ned's influence, a testament to the Stark's growing reputation as a man who could bend the city without overt force. By the end of the month, the streets of King's Landing had changed, though few could put their finger on why. Guards moved differently, merchants whispered differently, and even the common folk seemed to sense the new order. Ned Stark had not declared war, nor had he raised his banners in defiance. Yet the city itself had begun to yield to him. The Stark's shadow stretched long, a quiet but unmistakable warning. Power in Westeros had shifted, and the man who had once died for honor would now thrive as its most dangerous presence. Every whisper, every glance, every misstep by the ambitious or treacherous became fodder for his inexorable strategy. Ned Stark was no longer just a lord of the North. He had become a storm that Westeros could neither predict nor resist, a danger that would reshape the Seven Kingdoms forever. Winter had begun to settle over King's Landing, a pale frost creeping along the Red Keep's walls, yet within those walls, the city burned with tension. Ned Stark's presence was like a slow-moving avalanche, quiet, almost invisible, until it struck with unstoppable force. Every noble and courtier in the city had begun to measure their words before speaking, fearing the wolf whose teeth could bite without warning. The Lannisters, though wealthy and powerful, realized too late that they were playing a dangerous game against a man whose strategy was no longer guided by honor, but by a cold, precise vision of dominance. The first overt confrontation came when Ned discovered a plot to assassinate him using one of Robert's own guards, a plan orchestrated by a coalition of minor Lannister allies. Where once he might have reported the threat to the king or confronted the conspirators openly, Ned now moved in silence. That night, he summoned his own network of loyalists from both the north and the city itself. Under the cover of darkness, the would-be assassins were intercepted, their plan revealed in painstaking detail, and their leaders quietly removed. By dawn, the streets whispered only of the silent justice of the Hand, a justice so swift and unseen that few dared question it. The lesson was clear. Ned Stark was no longer a man to negotiate with. He was a force to be respected, obeyed, or feared. Cersei, enraged by the failure of her schemes, attempted a more direct approach. She summoned Ned to a private meeting under the pretense of alliance, presenting threats veiled as counsel and promises of shared power. Ned accepted, as he always did, but he listened with patience, never interrupting, never betraying the storm inside. By the end of their meeting, it was Cersei who left unsettled, realizing that the Stark she had once assumed could be swayed now saw every move before it was made. In subtle gestures, Ned had revealed just enough knowledge of her plans to intimidate her without exposing his own hand, leaving her to question the loyalties of even her closest allies. The game of manipulation, long a Lannister specialty, was now being played in the Northmen's favor. Meanwhile, Ned's influence over the small folk of King's Landing began to grow in quiet but tangible ways. Markets were subtly redirected to favor allies, trade agreements renegotiated to bolster loyal merchants, and minor criminals discreetly punished to maintain order. The city itself began to respond to him, unconsciously obeying the rhythm of his plans. Those who once ignored the hand now felt his presence everywhere, in the shifting of guards, in the whispered warnings of neighbors, in the subtle consequences of misdeeds. Ned Stark had become not just a ruler, but an invisible authority whose power was felt in every corner of the capital. Even Robert began to notice the changes, though he misread them as the effects of Ned's diligence and loyalty. "You've done well, Eddard," the king said one afternoon, laughing over a goblet of wine, "but don't get too clever. You're a northerner, leave politics to those who enjoy it." Ned smiled politely, hiding the truth. He had already rewritten the rules of politics in King's Landing. He did not enjoy power the way Robert imagined. He wielded it like a weapon, coldly, with precision. The king's amusement did little to distract him from his larger plans. If Robert could not see the shift, that was to Ned's advantage, allowing him to operate without interference while the city and court slowly fell under his control. The first major victory came in the form of the City Watch. Ned identified the captain as someone whose loyalty could be bought or broken, depending on circumstance. Rather than confront him openly, Ned engineered a series of small failures and scandals that discredited the captain, eroding his authority in subtle but effective ways. Within weeks, the captain's influence had waned, and Ned replaced him with a man loyal to the North, loyal to Ned, and most importantly, aware of the consequences of disobedience. With the City Watch now aligned with his plans, Ned had both eyes and ears across King's Landing, further cementing his invisible grip on the capital. But control was not enough for Ned. Fear was equally necessary. A merchant who had previously insulted him, claiming the North was weak and honor-bound, vanished one evening, leaving only a message scrawled in blood. "The wolf does not forgive." The city murmured with unease, not knowing who had sent the message, yet understanding its meaning. Ned had not revealed himself, yet his warning resonated through every street and alley. This was the new Stark, decisive, unyielding, and willing to use the shadows as effectively as the sun. The capital had begun to understand that Ned Stark was a danger not just to enemies, but to anyone who underestimated him. Even the court of King Robert felt the pressure. Ministers and lords who had once plotted openly against each other now measured their words carefully, aware that any misstep might reach the hand's ears and carry consequences they could not foresee. Tyrion Lannister, ever perceptive, began to piece together the subtle networks Ned had built, recognizing that the Northman had transformed into something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. "He does not fight openly," Tyrion muttered, observing Ned during a council meeting, "yet everyone bends to him, whether they know it or not. He's a storm you cannot see until it's too late." The tension reached a critical point when a faction of Southern lords attempted to challenge Ned's authority, believing that the North's influence was temporary, rooted only in Robert's favoritism. Ned responded with a precision that stunned even the most ambitious nobles. He called for a council in the throne room, inviting the dissenting lords under the guise of mediation. When they arrived, Ned methodically dismantled their arguments, exposing each lie, each hidden motive, each betrayal. By the end of the session, the lords left humiliated, their power diminished, and the rest of the council deeply aware of the hand's absolute control. Where once diplomacy might have tempered the outcome, now the outcome was dictated by Ned's presence alone. Fear had replaced negotiation, respect had replaced trust, and the city's power structure had been irrevocably altered. By the end of the first winter month, King's Landing had changed. The streets were quieter, not because of peace, but because no one dared make a sound that could be heard by the wrong ears. Alliances shifted quietly, and even the Lannisters began to tread cautiously, realizing the wolf in their midst was no longer just loyal, it was unstoppable. Ned Stark had entered the city as an honorable hand, yet he now ruled it in every way that mattered. not through fear alone, not through force alone, but through strategy, observation, and the knowledge that one man could control the fates of thousands without ever drawing a sword. As he stood on the battlements one evening, looking down at the flickering torches below, Ned allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The city was his chessboard, and every piece moved exactly as he intended. Yet he also knew the game was far from over. The Lannisters, clever and dangerous, would not yield easily. And beyond the Red Keep, in the distant north, Robb and the other Starks awaited guidance, learning the lessons their father had forged through blood, shadow, and cunning. Ned Stark was no longer the man who had once died for honor. He was something far more formidable, a storm, patient and inevitable, ready to reshape Westeros itself. Ned Stark had learned that power was not given, it was seized with precision, patience, and when necessary, ruthlessness. The city had grown quiet under his influence, yet silence did not mean peace. The Lannisters were still plotting, still scheming, and Ned knew they would not yield without challenge. He had spent weeks observing their habits, studying their movements, and identifying weak points in both their loyalty and their alliances. Now he was ready to strike, not with brute force alone, but with a series of calculated moves that would make every noble in the Seven Kingdoms reconsider what it meant to cross a Stark. The first target was Cersei Lannister herself. Ned did not confront her publicly. He did not need to. Instead, he began to manipulate the court subtly, isolating her from allies who might defend her and exposing secrets she had assumed safely hidden. Letters intercepted, whispers in the hallways, servants questioned carefully, all small actions, each seemingly inconsequential, yet collectively they undermined her position. By the time Cersei realized what was happening, she found herself increasingly alone, her influence shrinking with every passing day. Ned Stark had transformed intrigue into a weapon, and the weapon was deadly. Tywin Lannister, far more calculating than his children, recognized the danger and sought to counter it. He sent letters, arranged meetings, and attempted to sway the king's opinion subtly. Hopping Robert's trust in Ned could be turned to suspicion, but the Stark had anticipated every move. He planted false evidence, exposed betrayals that Tywin did not know existed, and created small crises that forced Tywin to react defensively rather than offensively. Within weeks, the Hand of the North had reshaped the perception of power in the city without ever lifting a sword. The Lannisters were beginning to understand that their wealth, cunning, and influence were now tools for Ned's games, not their own. The Stark children watched closely, each learning lessons they would never forget. Sansa understood the subtle power of appearances, the weight a carefully chosen word could carry. Arya watched the shadows, learning that patience and observation could equal the force of 1,000 swords. Jon Snow learned that true loyalty was built on respect, fear, and competence. Ned had begun shaping them into extensions of his will, heirs to a power far beyond their noble birthright. These lessons were harsh, but necessary. Westeros did not reward the kind or the innocent. It rewarded those who survived, those who adapted, those who struck before the enemy could see the attack coming. The first open confrontation came with the small council, where tensions between northern and southern interests had long simmered. Ned positioned himself strategically, asking questions that seemed casual but revealed hidden alliances and unspoken agendas. One by one, southern lords began to squirm under his gaze. A careless remark here, a hesitant answer there, and Ned had effectively neutralized their influence without violence. By the time the council adjourned, the room was filled with unease. Even those who had long believed themselves untouchable realized that Ned Stark was no longer merely a hand or a friend of the king. He was a force capable of bending the entire council to his will, and perhaps even bending the king himself. In private, Ned allowed himself to consider his next move, direct action against the Lannisters' greatest advantage, the gold and influence that flowed from Casterly Rock to the capital. Using his network of spies and loyalists, he began intercepting shipments, redirecting funds, and subtly influencing merchants who depended on Lannister contracts. No one could trace it back to him, yet by the end of the month, Tywin's financial network had begun to falter in ways that were noticeable only to the most observant. The king noticed discrepancies in trade reports, minor rebellions in cities that relied on Lannister favor, and the subtle shift of influence toward northern allies. All of it pointed to Ned Stark, though he left no evidence, no trace, only the growing certainty that the Northman was a danger. Rumors began to spread outside the Red Keep. Servants, merchants, and small folk whispered of the hand who controlled everything quietly, invisibly, yet with absolute authority. Some claimed he could make men vanish with a glance, others said he knew every secret in the city before it was spoken. The stories were exaggerated, but they carried a kernel of truth. Ned had become a symbol, not just a man, and symbols in Westeros were often as powerful as armies. The city trembled quietly, waiting to see which move the wolf would make next. The next stage of Ned's campaign came with an unexpected ally, Varys, the Master of Whispers. The spider, curious and cautious, had long observed the shifting power dynamics and recognized the unique threat and potential posed by the Stark. Ned did not need to coerce Varys, he simply demonstrated his competence, his foresight, and his cold decisiveness. Within a week, the spider had begun feeding him intelligence, not for loyalty, but out of recognition that Ned now controlled the game. Together, they began to manipulate information flowing through the city, turning lies into traps and rumors into weapons. The Lannisters could plan no move without encountering a counter-strategy, often before they even realized they were being challenged. Ned also began to consider the larger realm beyond King's Landing. Reports from the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Stormlands hinted at unrest, small rebellions, bandits emboldened by the perception of a distracted capital. To most, these would seem minor. To Ned, they were opportunities. Using subtle guidance, letters, and carefully orchestrated threats, he began consolidating influence across the Seven Kingdoms, establishing alliances and suppressing dissent without ever revealing the full extent of his hand. The message was clear. The Wolf of the North was not contained by walls or rivers. He could strike anywhere. By the time winter deepened, Ned's campaign against the Lannisters had reached a turning point. He had exposed secret alliances, disrupted financial networks, and neutralized conspiracies. Cersei and Tywin, though cunning, were forced onto the defensive, unable to predict his next move. Robert, still unaware of the true depth of Ned's transformation, trusted him implicitly, providing the Stark with cover to maneuver without interference. And the people of King's Landing, nobles and commoners alike, had begun to accept that the man who had once been honored for his loyalty and justice now ruled through fear, intellect, and the quiet inevitability of his will. Even as he consolidated his control, Ned continued to shape his children. The lessons of the court, the city, and the streets of King's Landing were brutal but necessary. They watched, learned, and absorbed the methods of a father who had shed the constraints of honor for the power to survive and dominate. Westeros was a dangerous world, and Ned Stark understood that the survival of his family depended not on trust, not on loyalty, not even on love, but on the unshakable dominance of the wolf who had learned to strike first and strike without mercy. By the end of the season, the capital was transformed. Ned Stark had entered as the Hand of the King, a man of honor and loyalty. He now stood as the most dangerous man in Westeros, a figure whose influence stretched unseen but irresistible, whose strategy made kings and lords alike hesitate, and whose reach extended beyond the city walls to every corner of the realm. The Lannisters, for the first time in decades, felt uncertainty gnawing at their confidence. And Ned, standing atop the battlements one cold, clear night, looked down at the city with a predator's satisfaction. The game had changed, the board had shifted, and the Wolf of Winterfell had begun his reign. The tension in King's Landing had reached a fever pitch. Whispers filled the alleys, markets, and noble halls alike, each murmur carrying the same truth. Ned Stark was no longer a man to be measured by honor, but by power, precision, and fear. Even the City Watch, now firmly under his influence, moved like extensions of his will, enforcing order and rooting out dissent before it could gain momentum. Ned walked through the Red Keep corridors with a calm, measured presence that seemed unremarkable to the untrained eye, yet the subtle shift in the air around him betrayed the storm beneath. Every noble, every servant, every envoy knew that the Hand of the King no longer tolerated weakness, deceit, or hesitation, and soon the consequences of defying him would be visible for all to see. Cersei Lannister, desperate and furious, began her countermeasures. She attempted to rally the remaining loyalists within the court, sending secret letters to Tywin in Casterly Rock and even to foreign allies, hoping to form a coalition strong enough to strike Ned before his influence grew unassailable. But every effort was quietly undone. Ned had anticipated her moves long before she attempted them. Letters were intercepted, envoys subtly redirected or detained, and rumors planted that cast doubt on her motives. Each action was a whisper of power, a reminder that Ned could manipulate the city and the court without ever raising a sword. Fear had become his most effective weapon, and it spread faster than gold or armies ever could. The first open confrontation came when Cersei tried to test him publicly in the council chambers, calling out an accusation of mismanagement regarding the City Watch and suggesting that Ned had overstepped his authority. Where once Ned might have responded with caution or deference to the king, now he acted with precision and cold calculation. He dissected her argument calmly, exposing every flaw, every overreach, and every potential betrayal embedded within her words. The council watched in stunned silence as the queen realized she had underestimated him. Her influence eroded in that single meeting, and whispers of her failing grip spread through the city like wildfire. Ned did not gloat. He simply let the weight of his presence and reasoning do the work. In King's Landing, subtlety had become more deadly than swordplay. Beyond the council, Ned continued to consolidate control over the city and its networks. Merchants loyal to the Lannisters found their shipments delayed or redirected. Spies and informants loyal to southern houses were quietly compromised. In the shadows, Ned's agents moved like ghosts, intercepting communications and gathering intelligence that would have been impossible for most lords to obtain. He understood that true power lay not in open confrontation, but in the ability to see all moves before they were made, to anticipate threats, and to strike with untraceable force. The capital was transforming under his influence, though few could articulate exactly how. People only knew that the wolf had come south, and he was everywhere and nowhere at once. The Stark children, now deeply aware of their father's changed nature, began to take on their own roles. Sansa had learned the subtle power of appearances, understanding that every smile, every nod, every carefully chosen word could shift allegiances. Arya, already dangerous with a blade, began to study the shadowed spaces of the Red Keep, learning observation, patience, and timing from the man who had become more than a father. He was a master strategist, shaping the next generation of wolves. Jon Snow, ever loyal, served as both apprentice and enforcer, learning to temper bravery with the calculation that Ned now demanded. Together, the family became a quiet force, a North-born presence in the heart of the southern capital. Ned's first major public show of power came when he dealt with a faction of southern lords attempting to rally support against him. He invited them to a feast, promising hospitality and diplomacy, but under the surface, every element of the gathering had been orchestrated to expose their schemes. As the lords spoke, attempting to sway others with lies and half-truths, Ned guided the conversation subtly, posing questions that revealed alliances, exposed dishonesty, and made the most confident of men falter. By the end of the night, the lords departed humiliated, their authority diminished, and their influence in the court weakened. Word of the event spread quickly, reinforcing the reputation of the Stark as both brilliant and merciless, a figure who could dominate without force, yet strike with unstoppable precision. But Ned's plans extended beyond King's Landing. Reports from the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Stormlands indicated unrest, banditry, and noble dissent, all of which could destabilize the capital if left unchecked. Ned acted quietly, sending loyal agents to influence events in the provinces, forging alliances, and removing threats before they became serious. The wolf was no longer confined to the city. His presence reached across Westeros, invisible but undeniably effective. Those who thought to exploit the chaos in the south quickly found themselves thwarted by unseen hands, punished or persuaded with equal skill. Even Tywin Lannister, the most cunning of his opponents, struggled to adapt. His attempts to predict Ned's next moves were thwarted at every turn. The Stark anticipated his strategies, exposed hidden plots, and manipulated events with the precision of a master chess player. Cersei's frustration grew daily as her attempts to counter Ned's influence ended in failure. The city's perception shifted, the court adjusting unconsciously to the silent dominance of the Northmen who had arrived under the guise of honor, but now ruled through fear, intellect, and control. Amidst all this, Ned remained calm, patient, and deliberate. He did not seek spectacle, he did not need it. The city and the realm would bend to his will, not because of open force, but because every move, every whisper, and every decision reinforced the inevitability of his dominance. The Lannisters had wealth, allies, and cunning, but Ned had foresight, patience, and a cold ruthlessness tempered by the discipline of years in the north. The Game of Thrones was no longer simply a puzzle of honor and loyalty. It was a battlefield where the sharpest mind and the keenest eye determined the fate of kingdoms. The first sparks of rebellion began to ignite, quietly at first. Small uprisings in the Riverlands were encouraged by remnants of Lannister allies, bandits emboldened by perceived weakness in the capital, and opportunistic minor lords seeking advantage. But Ned acted swiftly. Using a combination of intelligence, influence, and carefully calculated force, he suppressed dissent while demonstrating his reach. Rebels were captured before they could organize fully, leaders quietly removed, and the perception of his omnipresence reinforced. The message was clear: the Wolf of Winterfell was unstoppable, inevitable, and everywhere at once. By the end of the season, King's Landing had changed in ways impossible to ignore. Fear and respect intertwined in the minds of the nobles and citizens alike. The Stark's influence spread outward, threatening the Lannisters and any who sought to challenge him. Robert remained oblivious to the full extent of the transformation, trusting the hand who had quietly turned the capital into his domain. And Ned, standing once more on the battlements of the Red Keep, looked down at the city with a predator's satisfaction. The game had shifted irreversibly, and the Wolf from Winterfell was no longer simply a player. He was a force that would determine the fates of kings, lords, and entire kingdoms. The chill of winter in King's Landing had become a mirror of the atmosphere in the Red Keep, tense, unyielding, and filled with the quiet promise of violence. Ned Stark had spent months building a network of spies, allies, and loyalists, all moving in concert like the unseen currents of a river, invisible yet unstoppable. Every attempt by the Lannisters to consolidate power had been countered, every whisper of conspiracy quietly dismantled. The city and the realm were shifting under his hand, and the Lannisters, though rich and cunning, were beginning to understand that they were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. Ned did not celebrate victories or issue proclamations. His power lay in subtlety, in the slow, inescapable tightening of his grip, leaving his enemies uncertain, fearful, and alone. Cersei's fury had reached new heights. She had attempted bribery, threats, and persuasion, but Ned was always one step ahead. He used her own schemes against her, turning alliances into traps and false whispers into weapons. Every time she tried to manipulate him, she found her own influence eroding quietly but irrevocably. Tywin, recognizing the danger, began to move openly, attempting to counteract Ned's invisible hand by sending armies to secure key positions and demanding loyalty from lords still wavering in their allegiance. Yet the Northern Wolf anticipated every maneuver, quietly undermining these efforts with strategic alliances, misinformation, and the careful placement of loyal men in positions where they could observe and intercept. The Lannisters were powerful, but Ned had become a force beyond mere wealth or cunning. The first direct confrontation occurred when Ned learned of a secret alliance forming between several southern houses and the Lannisters, a coalition intended to strike at the North's influence in the capital. Instead of attacking openly, Ned invited the leaders to a council under the pretense of negotiation, a strategy as old as Westeros itself, but executed with a precision that left no room for error. He asked questions that seemed innocuous, revealing loyalty and motive without accusation, getting each man to reveal more than he intended. Within hours, Ned had mapped the entire network of conspiracies, their leaders' ambitions laid bare, and he was able to neutralize the threat without spilling a drop of blood. Some of the nobles left humiliated, others frightened, and all realized that the man who had once been the honorable Lord of Winterfell now moved with a cunning that rivaled the most dangerous schemers in the realm. This success emboldened Ned further. He did not merely want to survive in the capital, he wanted to dominate it entirely, to ensure that no scheme could ever threaten his family or the North again. Using his network of spies, he discovered that a shipment of gold intended to bribe key lords and mercenaries had been routed through the city. In a single, decisive operation, Ned intercepted the funds, leaving the conspirators confused and financially crippled. He did not publicize his actions. He did not need to. The effect was immediate. The balance of power subtly shifted, and the Lannisters realized that the Northern Wolf could strike without warning, unseen, and unstoppable. Fear began to dominate their strategy, and fear was a tool far more powerful than armies in a city ruled by intrigue. Meanwhile, the Stark children were learning lessons they would carry for life. Sansa understood the importance of appearances and persuasion. Realizing that power could be maintained without the need for violence if one's reputation was untouchable, Arya absorbed the lesson of patience, observation, and timing, watching her father manipulate events with a calm precision that would have terrified the most experienced assassin. Jon Snow, loyal to a fault but growing sharper under his father's guidance, learned that loyalty alone could not protect him. Survival required adaptability, cunning, and the willingness to strike decisively when necessary. The lessons were harsh, but in Westeros, harshness was the only true education in power. The next phase of Ned's strategy involved targeting the Lannisters, remaining influence within the capital. He began undermining key advisors, planting seeds of doubt, and creating situations where their own missteps would weaken their position. One by one, trusted allies of the Lannisters found themselves isolated, their influence reduced, and their credibility questioned. Ned's methods were subtle: a comment here, a carefully orchestrated rumor there, or the quiet placement of a loyalist in a critical position. By the time the Lannisters realized what was happening, the network they had relied on to maintain power had begun to crumble under the weight of invisible manipulation. Even Robert, blissfully unaware of the depth of Ned's transformation, began to notice the subtle changes in the capital. While he assumed that Ned's effectiveness stemmed from diligence and loyalty, the king could not deny the growing unease among his court, nor the shift in power dynamics that seemed to favor the hand at every turn. Ned's patience allowed him to operate under the king's nose, consolidating power without provoking overt suspicion. Yet every decision he made tightened his grip on both the city and the broader political landscape. The first open violence occurred when a small faction of southern lords, frustrated by Ned's subtle domination, attempted to incite a riot in the market districts to destabilize his control. Ned acted swiftly and decisively. His agents moved through the streets, intercepting the ringleaders, quietly detaining troublemakers, and isolating the instigators without drawing attention to the Hand himself. By the time the chaos had been quelled, the city had witnessed the efficiency of his control and the consequences of resistance. The message was unmistakable: defiance would be met with invisible but absolute retribution. The wolf did not roar publicly, but his bite was lethal. Even the smallest of actions reinforced Ned's growing reputation. A corrupt merchant attempting to cheat northern traders was quietly stripped of his license, his debts exposed, and his business destroyed, all without a public confrontation. A minor noble plotting to rally support against the North found his letters intercepted, his alliances undermined, and his credibility destroyed. In every corner of King's Landing, from the Red Keep to the streets below, Ned's influence was felt, and with it came fear, respect, and the undeniable truth that the wolf from Winterfell had arrived to reshape the city and the kingdom according to his will. By the end of the winter, the Lannisters were weakened, their allies uncertain, and the capital itself under the shadow of a northern hand that could strike at any moment. Ned Stark had transformed from a man defined by honor into the most dangerous figure in Westeros, a presence that commanded loyalty, obedience, and fear. The Game of Thrones had shifted irreversibly, and the balance of power had moved in favor of the wolf. No longer merely a lord of the North, Ned had become a storm, patient, calculated, and inevitable, ready to shape the seven kingdoms according to his vision. The city, the realm, and even the king himself were now pawns in a game they could no longer control. Winter had fully gripped King's Landing, yet inside the Red Keep, the air was hotter with tension than ever before. Ned Stark had spent months weaving a web of control, and now the threads were taut, ready to snap at the slightest misstep by anyone who dared oppose him. The Lannisters, though still wealthy and cunning, had been systematically neutralized, their influence eroded by a combination of fear, intelligence, and subtle manipulation. Cersei's schemes now faltered before they could gain traction. Tywin's calculations were constantly countered, and even Robert, oblivious to the full scope of the Hand's power, could not ignore the shifting dynamics around him. The wolf had claimed the heart of the capital, and the city moved as he dictated, quietly, inevitably, and with deadly precision. Ned's consolidation of power was not done through spectacle but through strategy. He began to implement sweeping changes across the city, reinforcing his control while destabilizing any remaining opposition. The City Watch, now entirely loyal to him, patrolled with efficiency and discretion, rooting out bribery, corruption, and sedition without public trials that might draw attention to the Hand's methods. Merchants and minor lords found themselves compelled to cooperate with northern allies or face slow but inevitable ruin. Ned's influence stretched beyond visible authority. It was in the quiet rearrangement of power, the subtle redirection of resources, and the unspoken understanding that resistance would bring consequences far beyond mere reprimand. The Lannisters, sensing their grip slipping entirely, attempted one final maneuver. They convened a secret council of their most loyal allies, plotting to undermine Ned's position through bribery, intimidation, and even the threat of open rebellion. They assumed he could be manipulated through the king, through fear, or through overt force. They did not understand that Ned Stark no longer relied on overt strength or traditional honor. He anticipated every move, each plan subtly turned against them before it was executed. When he learned of the meeting, he did not confront them directly. Instead, he used intelligence, deception, and precision to dismantle their alliances. Letters were intercepted, envoys redirected, and doubts planted so effectively that the coalition crumbled from within. By the time the Lannisters realized what had happened, their supposed allies had turned or disappeared, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. Ned's methods had become legendary in the capital. Servants whispered of his reach, merchants feared crossing him, and nobles recalculated every action with the possibility that he might already know their intentions. He had become both omnipresent and invisible, a presence that commanded obedience without threat of public violence. Those who had underestimated him in the past, the ambitious, the arrogant, the wealthy, now approached every decision with caution, knowing that missteps could be fatal. Ned's transformation from honorable lord to calculating strategist was complete, and the city had become a reflection of his will, orderly, precise, and under the unshakable shadow of the Northmen. The Stark children were now active participants in the unfolding change. Sansa, guided by her father, had learned to wield appearances as weapons, influencing allies and enemies alike through subtle persuasion. Arya, ever observant, moved through the city's shadows, gathering intelligence, listening to whispers, and reporting back with insights that augmented her father's strategies. Jon Snow, loyal and cautious, began to command small operations, testing his own understanding of influence and power. Together, they were no longer merely children of Winterfell. They were extensions of a calculated hand that now dominated the heart of the realm. Ned had transformed them, shaping the next generation of wolves who would carry his legacy and his methods forward. The first open clash came when a minor southern lord attempted to resist Ned's authority directly, calling for mercenaries and openly challenging northern influence in the city. Ned did not hesitate. He moved decisively, using a combination of loyal troops, intelligence, and intimidation to suppress the rebellion before it could spread. The lord was publicly disgraced, his men disbanded, and his allies either bribed or coerced into submission. The display was neither flashy nor cruel, but it was effective, a clear message that resistance was pointless, that the Northmen could strike decisively and with precision, and that any who defied him would face consequences far beyond expectation. King's Landing understood, without a word, that the wolf had arrived fully, and none could oppose him successfully. Cersei, now desperate and cornered, attempted one final gambit, seeking to manipulate Robert into dismissing Ned or forcing a confrontation. Yet Robert, though still oblivious to the full depth of Ned's ruthlessness, could not ignore the evidence of his effectiveness. Every challenge Ned faced, every conspiracy against him, had failed spectacularly, leaving the Lannisters weakened and humiliated. The king's trust in Ned, once a vulnerability for manipulation, had become a shield behind which the hand could operate, untouchable in his efficiency and untouchable in his reach. Cersei's desperation only highlighted the magnitude of Ned's transformation. She had moved from opponent to powerless observer in a matter of months, unable to influence events that had once seemed firmly within her control. Beyond the capital, Ned's influence extended quietly but effectively. Lords across the Seven Kingdoms began to recognize the Northmen as a power impossible to ignore. He had cultivated alliances, exposed plots, and eliminated threats without overt warfare, proving that control could be achieved through intelligence, fear, and careful manipulation as much as through armies. Rumors of the wolf's reach spread to the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Stormlands. A lord from Winterfell had entered the south, and without raising a sword, reshaped the balance of power. Westeros had never seen a man wield authority in such a manner, and both allies and enemies began to adjust their expectations, knowing that every decision carried consequences they could neither predict nor resist. The final consolidation came when Ned confronted the Lannisters in the Red Keep itself. He did not raise a sword, nor did he issue threats of execution. Instead, he dismantled their alliances, revealed hidden betrayals, and demonstrated, with quiet inevitability, that the city's power and its loyalty had shifted entirely. The Lannisters were left with wealth, influence, and pride, but none of it could protect them from the strategic mind that now controlled the capital. Ned Stark, the man who had once valued honor above all, now ruled through fear, intellect, and the unassailable certainty of his vision. By the end of winter, King's Landing, and indeed Westeros itself, had been reshaped. The city's streets moved to the rhythm of the northern wolf. The nobles whispered his name with caution. The king, though trusting, could not fully grasp the scope of his hand's dominance. Ned Stark had transformed from a man of honor into the most dangerous figure in the Seven Kingdoms, patient, calculated, and inevitable. Every action, every strategy, every subtle manipulation had brought him to this point, where no one could oppose him successfully, and the balance of power had shifted irreversibly in his favor. From the battlements of the Red Keep, Ned looked down over the city, the winter wind biting at his face but failing to pierce the sense of absolute control he felt. The wolf had arrived, and Westeros had been forced to bend, to adapt, or to falter. His enemies were broken, his children shaped to continue his legacy, and his vision for the Seven Kingdoms, rooted in order, intelligence, and the quiet but absolute exercise of power, was taking shape. Ned Stark had become more than a lord, more than a hand, more than a man. He had become a force of nature, unstoppable, inevitable, and utterly dangerous. And in that winter, under the shadow of the Red Keep, the Wolf of Winterfell had finally claimed his place, not as a loyal hand, not as a man of honor, but as the most dangerous presence Westeros had ever known, a predator whose reach extended across cities, kingdoms, and hearts alike, shaping the fate of the realm with the quiet inevitability of a storm. The winter deepened, but Ned Stark's ambitions did not waver. King's Landing had fallen under his subtle yet absolute control, and yet he understood that the true test of his power lay beyond the walls of the city. The Seven Kingdoms were still a patchwork of old rivalries, fragile loyalties, and simmering resentments, and it would take more than fear alone to command them. Ned began to move quietly, sending envoys north and south, east and west, not as messengers, but as instruments of influence, carrying threats veiled as counsel, promises cloaked in warning, and intelligence crafted to shape decisions before they were even considered. Lords and minor kings began to notice a pattern. Wherever Ned's presence or his agents reached, plots unraveled, conspiracies failed, and loyalty shifted like sand under a tide. In the Riverlands, where houses long allied to the Lannisters had grown bold in the perceived absence of authority, Ned orchestrated a series of subtle yet devastating strikes. Small skirmishes with bandits and opportunistic lords were engineered to reveal who could be trusted and who could be coerced. Rebels who had plotted against northern influence found their supplies cut, their allies turned against them, and their forces quietly dismantled. None of this was done openly. Ned did not seek spectacle. Instead, his hand reached across miles and rivers invisibly, and by the time the news reached King's Landing, the power structures of the Riverlands had quietly shifted. Every lord knew that resistance was dangerous, yet the source of danger was nearly invisible. The wolf from Winterfell had extended his shadow, and no one could touch it. To the north, Ned's influence was no less significant. While Robb Stark and his bannermen prepared for the coming thaw, Ned instructed them not only in matters of war, but in the subtleties of command, control, and manipulation. The young Stark, bright and ambitious, observed his father with a mixture of awe and fear, realizing that the lessons he had once considered harsh were in fact strategies to shape loyalty, fear, and obedience. Ned's influence in the north had always been strong, but now it was strengthened by the knowledge that the same methods could dominate the south. The north would not merely survive, it would hold Westeros in a grip that no king, no lord, and no Lannister could resist. Even the Vale began to feel the quiet pressure of the northern wolf. Through emissaries, strategic marriages, and subtle threats masked as counsel, Ned began to sway lords whose loyalties had long been tied to distant and unreliable allegiances. He exploited old rivalries, fanned suspicions, and offered protection with a promise that was impossible to refuse. The lords of the Vale were cautious, but even their famed sense of independence could not resist the slow inevitability of Ned's influence. By the time they realized what was happening, their choices had been narrowed to obedience or ruin, and most chose survival, aligning quietly with the growing power of the Hand of Winterfell. Back in King's Landing, Ned's consolidation of power reached into the court itself. Ministers, small lords, and even the king's closest advisors began to recognize the new order. Ned Stark's reach was absolute, his foresight unmatched, and his patience lethal. Minor disputes were solved before they erupted, plots dissolved before they could be enacted, alliances shifted subtly, often before those involved even realized what had changed. Fear had become a constant companion for the powerful and ambitious, and respect mingled uneasily with it. Ned did not need to make threats. His reputation carried them for him. The capital moved to his rhythm, its inhabitants dancing to the silent orders of a man whose strategy had replaced the chaos of politics with the precision of inevitability. Yet Ned understood that fear alone would not be enough to shape the Seven Kingdoms. He began to develop a network of loyalists within the ranks of every city, town, and village under his influence. Merchants, guild leaders, minor nobles, and even common soldiers became instruments of his vision, whether willingly or out of necessity. Each network operated independently, yet every thread was connected, creating a web of control that extended far beyond the Red Keep. The Lannisters and other rivals had wealth and armies, but they lacked the subtlety, patience, and coordination that had become Ned's signature. The wolf did not merely strike. He anticipated, planned, and shaped the entire battlefield before the first blow was even exchanged. Even the smallest gestures reinforced his growing legend. A corrupt official discovered embezzling funds found his career quietly destroyed and his wealth redistributed to loyal northern merchants. A minor lord plotting rebellion suddenly received letters from supposed allies urging caution, only to find himself isolated and vulnerable. News of these events spread quietly, and though the exact source remained a mystery, the result was unmistakable. Resistance to Ned Stark was dangerous, invisible, and inevitable. The wolf had become a figure whose reach extended into every corner of Westeros, shaping events before they could occur, guiding the actions of kings, lords, and commoners alike. In the south, the Lannisters, desperate and humiliated, attempted once more to challenge his influence. Cersei's threats, Tywin's schemes, and their combined wealth could not overcome the careful orchestration of Ned's strategy. Small skirmishes and subtle manipulations crushed their attempts at rebellion before they could gain traction, leaving them isolated and exposed. Even allies they had assumed loyal turned, whether through intimidation, persuasion, or careful suggestion. By the end of the season, it became clear to all in the capital that the wolf had arrived fully, that his control was invisible yet absolute, and that no one, not king, not lord, not mercenary, could oppose him successfully. Despite the fear and the control, Ned remained disciplined, patient, and calculating. He did not celebrate victories, he did not indulge cruelty, and he did not make mistakes. Every action was precise, every strategy deliberate, and every outcome meticulously orchestrated. In the quiet of the Red Keep, he planned the next stage of his influence, uniting the Seven Kingdoms not through open conquest, but through the silent imposition of his will, the subtle reshaping of alliances, and the quiet destruction of all opposition. Westeros, he realized, would bend not because of armies or swords, but because of the inevitability of his presence, a wolf whose shadow stretched across every city, village, and battlefield, unstoppable, patient, and utterly dangerous. From the battlements of the Red Keep, overlooking a city that had been transformed into his dominion, Ned Stark reflected on the path that had brought him here. He had entered King's Landing as a man defined by honor, a hand loyal to the king. Now he was a force beyond honor, a strategist beyond measure, and a presence that reshaped Westeros itself. His enemies were scattered, his allies disciplined, and his children prepared to continue the legacy of the wolf. The game had shifted, and no one could contest his dominion, not the Lannisters, not petty kings, not even the whims of fate. And as the cold wind of winter swept across the Red Keep, carrying the distant sounds of a city both alive and subdued, Ned Stark's mind moved forward, planning the next moves, the next expansions of his influence, and the next inevitable steps toward controlling the Seven Kingdoms. The wolf had arrived, and the realm had begun to bend to his will, one calculated decision at a time. By the time spring arrived, the Seven Kingdoms had been quietly but irreversibly reshaped. Ned Stark, once the honorable Lord of Winterfell, now moved through Westeros like a shadow that could not be escaped. The Lannisters, their wealth and cunning, rendered useless against his patient strategy, had become spectators of their own downfall, unable to strike without inviting consequences they could not foresee. Cersei, her pride broken and her schemes thwarted at every turn, had learned what everyone in the realm now understood. The Wolf of Winterfell could not be bargained with, outmaneuvered, or defeated. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, a force whose intellect, foresight, and control were more terrifying than any army. Ned had expanded his influence far beyond King's Landing. The Riverlands, the Vale, and even the Stormlands now operated under his subtle guidance, their lords cautious, their alliances tempered by fear and respect, and their rebellions swiftly and quietly crushed before they could grow. The North remained loyal, its armies disciplined not merely by bloodlines, but by the lessons of strategy and ruthlessness imparted by their lord. Ned's children, now sharp, cautious, and capable, were extensions of his will, ensuring that the legacy of the wolf would endure long after he was gone. Arya's eyes gleamed with the patience of an assassin, Sansa maneuvered through courts like a practiced diplomat, and Jon Snow commanded with the precision of a seasoned general. Together, they were unstoppable. The final confrontation with the Lannisters was quiet but decisive. Tywin's remaining forces, spread thin and demoralized, attempted one last strike to regain control of the south. Ned met them not with open battle, but with strategy, interception, and manipulation. He cut off supply lines, turned allies against one another, and left Tywin isolated and humiliated. Cersei, forced to watch her empire crumble without recourse, could do nothing but submit. The Lannisters' power, built over decades, had been dismantled by a man who never sought glory, never boasted, and never made a mistake. Ned Stark had become the invisible hand that controlled the Seven Kingdoms. Even King Robert, oblivious to the full extent of Ned's transformation, could not deny the changes around him. The court, the city, and the realm had shifted under the influence of the wolf. Nobles acted with caution, soldiers followed orders with precision, and even enemies of the North found themselves powerless against a strategist whose reach extended into every corner of the kingdom. Ned's legend spread quietly yet undeniably, fear and respect intertwined in every whispered tale. The man who had once been known for honor and loyalty was now the most dangerous figure Westeros had ever seen, a ruler not in title, but in influence, control, and inevitability. With the Lannisters neutralized and the kingdoms aligned under his invisible hand, Ned turned his attention to shaping the future. He reformed trade, secured borders, and encouraged loyalty through a mixture of subtle persuasion and quiet intimidation. The realm began to stabilize not through brute force, but through the inevitability of his control. Every noble, from the smallest lord to the most ambitious king, recognized that resistance was impossible without risking ruin. Westeros, once a chaotic landscape of ambition and betrayal, now bent to the calm, precise, and unrelenting will of the wolf from Winterfell. In the quiet of his chambers, Ned reflected on the path he had taken. The man who once believed honor was the highest virtue had learned the hard truth. Survival required strategy, patience, and above all, control. He had sacrificed the simplicity of morality for the complexity of power, yet in doing so, he had secured the safety, influence, and future of his family and his homeland. The cost had been high, and the shadow he cast long, but the wolf's dominion was now complete. The world had learned, at last, that Ned Stark was not merely a lord or a hand of the king. He was the most dangerous presence in Westeros, a force that reshaped kingdoms with thought, patience, and precision. From the battlements of the Red Keep, looking out over a city that had become a reflection of his will, Ned allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The streets below were quiet, the nobles cautious, the enemies powerless. The wolf had arrived, and Westeros had bent to his vision. The North remained strong, his children prepared to continue his legacy, and the Seven Kingdoms, for all their history of chaos and betrayal, had been tamed, not by armies or swords, but by the cold, precise inevitability of Ned Stark. The Game of Thrones had been rewritten, and the wolf from Winterfell had emerged not merely victorious, but untouchable, unstoppable, and immortalized in fear and respect alike. Ned Stark's reign as the most dangerous man in Westeros had begun, and no force, no scheme, and no ambition could challenge the inevitability of the wolf. The North had triumphed, the South had fallen silent, and Westeros itself had learned that the wolf never forgives, never hesitates, and never falters. From Winterfell to King's Landing, from the Riverlands to the Stormlands, the story of the wolf's rise would echo for generations, a reminder that power was not granted by birth, honor, or luck, but by strategy, patience, and the unyielding will to dominate. And so the legend of Ned Stark was sealed, not as a man of honor or mercy, but as the wolf whose patience, cunning, and unrelenting hand reshaped an entire kingdom. Westeros would never forget, and no one would dare challenge the most dangerous man it had ever known. The Seven Kingdoms had fallen into a quiet, unshakable order under Ned Stark's rule. King's Landing, once a nest of schemers and liars, now moved to the rhythm of the wolf's will. The Lannisters, stripped of influence and humiliated, had learned that wealth and cunning could not match foresight, patience, and absolute control. Even Robert, blissfully unaware of the full depth of Ned's transformation, could sense that the kingdom had shifted under the hand's unseen hand. Ned's children, shaped by his lessons in strategy and vigilance, had become instruments of his legacy. Arya's eyes gleamed with calculated patience, Sansa's words carried subtle power, and Jon Snow moved with disciplined command. Together, they ensured the wolf's dominion would last long after his own reign ended. From the north to the south, lords whispered of the wolf who could strike without warning, see without being seen, and shape events before they occurred. Fear and respect intertwined wherever his influence reached. Ned Stark had become more than a man of honor. He was a force, patient, precise, and inevitable. Westeros had been reshaped, not by armies or battles, but by the quiet, unstoppable will of the wolf. And so the legend was sealed. The North had triumphed, the South humbled, and Ned Stark became the most dangerous man the Seven Kingdoms would ever know.